I felt less than human. He's howling like an animal.
The truth is the word.
And that's all I spoke.
You know, it was just this eerie moment where he's howling.
Did they all come in and lie in court?
In this video, I'll explain the linguistic tactics that point to personality traits that we all should watch out for. The video focuses on Amber Heard, but the things I point out could be said about many other people, celebrities, politicians, and people we know. I hope you find it useful. Let's go for it.
I think vast majority of this trial was played out on social media. I think that this trial is an example of that gone haywire, gone amok, and the jury is not immune to that.
You think the jury saw it?
How could they not? I think even the most well-intentioned juror, it would have been impossible to avoid this.
However, strangely enough, social media weren't so bad when she wrote the op-ed that made people angry with Johnny Depp and put his career in jeopardy, to say the least. Where was her criticism of the people who were angry with Depp? This is the first hint that Heard sees the world from her own narrow perspective. This is deliberate. It keeps her from having to hold herself accountable and consider the validity of the evidence against her.
After 3.5 weeks, I took the stand and saw just a courtroom packed full of Captain Jack Sparrow fans who were vocal, energized.
With this kind of reference to Depp, Heard insinuates that people were too wrapped up in fiction to see what the reality was. Linguistically, she depersonalizes Depp and makes his case against her seem frivolous. For people like Heard who go to great lengths, or any length, to not lose face, it's easier to admit defeat to things that are out of their control, social media and popularity, than evidence. We also see that next.
Do you think that maybe he just had better lawyers?
I will say his lawyers did certainly a better job of distracting the jury from the real issues.
So it can't be the evidence against her and her lack of evidence that persuaded the jury. No, it has to be the rhetorical tactics of Depp's lawyers. Anything else would be devastating to her defense. The perspective here is worth noting. Heard's talking from a position above the jurors, and unlike them, allegedly, she's smart enough to see what was really going on, according to her. Heard's self-protective language is non-stop.
For some people, they just were frankly disgusted by the whole thing and don't have much sympathy for either one of you. Can you understand that?
Absolutely. I would not blame the average person for looking at this and how it's been covered and not think that it is Hollywood brats at their worst.
Initially, it sounds like Heard's in agreement, but she makes a notable modification. She says she wouldn't blame the average person for thinking that, considering how it's been covered. This is important because Heard's entire defense rests on the unfair social media coverage and not the evidence. This minimizes Heard's responsibility in how people have perceived her and minimizes her attempt to sound in agreement.
Can you understand that?
Absolutely.
Next, she keeps speaking from this elevated position as she goes on to talk about what people supposedly don't understand. Thus, she continues to minimize her agreement and criticizes the public instead.
But what people don't understand is it's actually so much bigger than that. This is not only about our First Amendment right to speak.
People like Heard will often pretend to advocate for a bigger cause and want what's best for the common good in order to disguise their self-serving motives. This is especially true when they face backlash, as if this supposed bigger cause is of any relevance in a courtroom, and as if she speaks on other people's behalf. This level of manipulation is identical to the level of manipulation in a performance in court.
Trauma until I realized I could do something with it. So to answer your question, Ben, I was able to turn the things that I've lived through, my pain, my life experiences, into work, into action, into providing a voice for other people. I'm not a saint. I'm not trying to present myself as one, as you all know, but I selfishly found relief in being able to use what I've lived through to advocate for others, to bring light to these issues, to give a voice to people who don't have the voice and the platform that I have. And while I would not wish this situation on my worst enemy, if it gives a voice to someone who doesn't have it.
Heard's statements, with the platitude voice as the main focus, are a testament to her sense of self-importance.
A voice to voice, a voice.
She humble brags when she says she selfishly found relief in helping people. Humble brag is a seemingly self-deprecating statement that's actually used for the opposite effect, to highlight one's alleged positive qualities. Here, the word selfishly is supposed to be self-deprecating. However, when the context is helping other people, it's not wrong but loving to be selfish, and Heard knows that. This is impression management. She doesn't let the audience make their own inferences. This shows how deliberate her pathos tactics are, appealing to the jury members' emotion and pity, trying to make herself seem smaller than she is. When the interviewer challenges Heard on her definition of freedom of speech, Heard also makes herself seem smaller than she is, as she portrays herself as a victim. But first, she gives us an inspiring history lesson.
But here's the thing about the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects free speech. It doesn't protect lies that amount to defamation. And that was the issue in the case.
We get the concept of free speech from the Greeks. My understanding of what that means is not just the freedom to speak. It's a freedom to speak truth to power.
But truth is the word.
Yes.
And that was the issue.
And that's all I spoke. And I spoke it to power, and I paid the price.
So now the verdict isn't only a result of social media, but also a result of her inferior status right from the beginning. Now, supposedly, she's merely one of many victims who lose cases because they're brave enough to speak truth to power, which is the self-aggrandizing cliché she uses. Sure, because it couldn't have been the evidence against her specifically that led to the verdict. This kind of reasoning, how does Heard explain all the times that ordinary people win over powerful people?
In the closing arguments, the Depp lawyer called your testimony the performance of a lifetime, and said you were acting. What do you say to that?
Says the lawyer for the man who convinced the world he had scissors for fingers. I'm the performer.
So if Heard had convinced the world that she was Mera from Aquaman, that means that people shouldn't believe her in a court case. Heard doesn't even see that her own logic can be used against her. In the following, notice her lack of self-reference when it comes to describing the things that she supposedly went through.
The Depp team argued that you were the abuser, that you instigated physical violence. Did you?
I never had to instigate it. I responded to it. When you're living in violence and it becomes normal, as I testified to, you have to adapt.
She says your and you, thus her language suggests that these aren't personal experiences. The phrase, as I testified to, points to what she did in court. It doesn't point back to the negative experiences that she claims to have had. This is distancing language. This kind of language is a pattern.
I mean, this is in black and white. I understand context. But you're testifying and you're just telling me today I never started a physical fight, and here you are on tape saying you did.
As I testified on the stand about this, is that when your life is at risk, not only will you take the blame for things that you shouldn't take the blame for, but when you're in an abusive dynamic, psychologically, emotionally, and physically, you don't have the resources that, say, you or I do with the luxury of saying, hey, this is black and white, because it's anything but when you're living in it.
She doesn't say that her life was at risk or that she took the blame for things. She keeps saying your life and you take the blame for things. And revealingly, she separates the impersonal pronoun you from the you and I with which she refers to herself and the interviewer.
You don't have the resources that, say, you or I do.
Thus, she doesn't give personal accounts. She doesn't even include herself in the generic circumstances she describes. And considering that Heard hasn't done anything but blame anything and everything but herself, it sounds rather incredible that she would take the blame in that kind of toxic relationship. However, she's proficient at imitating the right words that real victims would use and have emotional reactions to.
In an abusive dynamic, psychologically, emotionally, and physically.
This points to her being extremely cunning.
What about the witnesses who said they have seen you instigate physical violence.
I've seen firsthand how people will file rank and support the person they depend on.
Did they all come in and lie in court?
I am not here to call any of his witnesses any names.
Say you think they're lying without saying that you think they're lying. Her statements are a mix of two things that we've seen. The way she devalues the witnesses who can't trust what they've seen or haven't seen apparently, and the protagonist-antagonist framework with Depp as the powerful antagonist. There's no hint of her holding herself accountable. Next, she's asked about holding herself accountable. Notice how she minimizes it.
When I asked his lawyers, why do you think you won? And the answer I got was, because she never took responsibility for anything she did in the marriage.
I did do and say horrible, regrettable things throughout my relationship. I behaved in horrible, almost unrecognizable to myself ways.
Saving face is what this kind of accountability taking is about. First of all, she doesn't specify what these horrible, regrettable things are. Secondly, she doesn't say any of this of her own accord. She has to be asked about it. Thirdly, she says unrecognizable to myself ways, suggesting that her default mode is very different in a positive way, and also that she actually didn't behave in unrecognizable to herself ways, because she prefaces this phrase with the adverb almost.
There's so much, I have so much regret. I freely and openly and voluntarily talked about what I did. I talked about the horrible language. I talked about being pushed to the extent where I didn't even know the difference between, right and wrong.
Her uses passive voice, being pushed, which relieves her of accountability and assigns blame to the antagonist in her narrative, Depp. So even when she's supposed to show that she can hold herself accountable, she can't, despite her emphasis on how willing she is to hold herself accountable, which doesn't sound exaggerated or overcompensating at all.
Freely and openly and voluntarily.
Another thing to watch out for is people who are overly performative, people who are busier going for a reaction than simply telling what happened. This kind of behavior shows that the speaker lacks self-awareness, that he or she isn't aware of how manipulative their behavior comes across.
And he has the window down, he's smoking. It wasn't all the way down, but he's constantly smoking, and at some point he starts howling out of the window, and he's howling like an animal. Everyone just froze. No one did anything. And I too was torn as to what I should do. It was just this eerie moment where he's howling.
As you sit here with me now, has it sunk in?
How could it? I have never felt more removed from my own humanity. I felt less than human.
People like her know what to say, the right terminology, the right emotional appeals. But even the best linguistic tactics mean nothing without sincerity. See you next time.